Hey, everybody. I am Rick Coluccio, and you're listening to the Recruiting EQ podcast, a conversation show which advocates for emotional intelligence and the emotional quotient in things like recruitment, hiring, executive search, sales, especially now that we are all faced with using a bunch of AI tools for many different things and trying to figure that whole thing out. Today's episode is episode number 104, which we have called What Greatership Looks Like with Kenneth Greenberg. Ken, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Rick? Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. You and I have had a couple of super fascinating conversations, and I'm really stoked to get into a few different aspects of what we've talked about, and hopefully we can cover that in an hour. Who knows? But I almost wanted to call this episode, what great leadership looks like in the lower middle market in 2026, but there's not enough word count for us to do that.
Well, I think that's appropriate, right? Because that's kind of where we're focused. So.
Absolutely. So before we get too far down the rabbit hole of our topics, I would love it if you could just give listeners a little bit about who you are and what you're working on right now.
Sure. Well, I'm Ken Greenberg. As you said, I'm Senior Managing Director at Okta Search Partners. Pretty much been here about 10 years, and we recruit primarily senior level executives for private equity firm portfolio companies. So we don't do much recruiting internally for investment professionals. Although our founder at Okta came out of Michael Page many years ago, so he recruits for the middle market and lower middle market investment banking world, from analysts all the way up to managing directors. So that's what I'm primarily doing day to day, is talking to lots of C-level executives in a variety of industries on behalf of our private equity clients.
Thanks, Ken. And then two things. First of all, a lot of people see the word private equity and do think that means that you are in investment financial services recruitment. But working on the portfolio companies, if you could even just explain a little bit for those people who are curious and maybe don't work in the field, what the difference is essentially in who you're actually placing.
Sure. So just to be clear, so Hitesh, our partner who works in the investment bank world, he is recruiting financial professionals for investment banks, primarily sell-side investment banks. On our side, there's three of us. We're recruiting executives who work or will work in portfolio companies. So these are operating executives, CEOs, COOs, executive chairmen, CFOs, who are going to actually be in operating companies that are owned primarily by the private equity clients, but they're not investment professionals per se, right? They actually know how to operate manufacturing businesses, services businesses, so on and so forth. They may have some M&A experience behind them because they've done buy and builds, as they're called. They've executed add-ons, they've done merger integration, but they've done it as a principal, an operating principal in an operating company, not up at the private equity level or the fund level.
Yeah.
Is that helpful?
So it's very helpful. And I do think that I'll give you an example of how easy it is to misunderstand this. When I create these podcast episodes, I use the assistance of my good buddy Claude to do some of the grunt work around making LinkedIn posts with me. I still write my posts, but you know what I mean? Helping me find images that I can steal from Hollywood movies that I think are relevant, which is what I do for every event before the image goes away and so on. And Claude also just sort of automatically writes a bunch of prompt questions, which I almost never use. But usually they're fine. They're totally fine. In this particular case, all of them were about investment banking.
Right.
Just to show how sometimes you need a human being around to know this stuff.
Yeah, and we would agree with that. There's so much you can do with AI, and ultimately human discernment is necessary to utilize it effectively. So
yeah. And luckily, I know this from talking to you, and I understand the difference, so I didn't go ahead and make a whole episode around the wrong things. But it could have happened to someone else. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, fair enough.
So another thing I want to touch on before we go down the rabbit hole, maybe we can loop back to this afterwards, but you also have written a book.
Mm-hmm.
And that book is called Leadership, A Short Manual to Success. This is based on articles you've written over the years, based on your experience of working with these C-level operators in different companies in the lower middle market. What prompted you to collect these into a book? Like, why now?
Well, just to clarify, so it's not just my experience with operating executives in lower middle market. I actually taught leadership both at a local level at Chamber of Commerce's here in Colorado, and I taught it at the University of Denver at their university college at the graduate level. And so I knew enough about it where I was asked to teach it, right? So I took
Yeah,
that
really.
experience and what I experienced with in the lower middle market with executives, and I wrote articles over the years, and I got to thinking, boy, all those articles are sort of in different places. It'd be nice to curate them into a book, a manual, as we call it. It's very small. It's only about 35 pages. I tried to model it in terms of size after 1 Minute Manager, give a nod to that book. So it's
Right.
considered on your desk and you pick it up. Again, in the lower middle market, it's meant for-profit businesses, people selling goods or services to businesses or consumers, and contain information that's actionable that can help them move those companies towards better performance. And that's why I wrote the book.
Awesome. So that's part of why the title, based on our conversation leading up to this, our conversations leading up to this, is focused on leadership. You also find yourself in a position of kind of leadership advisory as well from time to time. It sounds like in your day to day.
Yeah, I think when we interview executives and we talk to our clients, we talk about leadership being a lever of value creation. And if it is a lever of value creation, what does great leadership look like in the lower middle market, especially for those companies that are focused on growth, because that's what our private equity clients want. They want these companies to grow, not just hold the status quo. So what are the attributes and what are the activities and behaviors of leaders in that market that lead to success? And the opposite is, what is the things to look out for that might lead to suboptimization or worse, failure of a portfolio company when you're looking at a particular leader? So we have that discussion both with the candidates when we're interviewing them and also with our clients as to what we focus on in terms of scorecarding the candidates that we bring to them. So
Yeah, that's super interesting. And so I have basically a million questions, and we'll see if we can get to them all
okay.
in the hour. But
Yeah.
one of the things that, for me, who's an outsider who didn't come up through any kind of investment banking or kind of like operator level uh, companies, even small companies, I had a couple startups when I was young. I did tech sales for a while. I went into recruitment, right? And my recruitment has not been in this field. But my observation from someone who's on the outside is that even just discussing private equity firms and what they do and their mergers and acquisitions and the desire to start a company that eventually gets private equity investment or is sold to private equity has gone from nobody knows those words and uses them in the popular culture to this is a little bit of a thing to now it's all anybody talks about when they're talking about entrepreneurship practically, unless they're talking about making a tech company that booms in some kind of app fashion.
Right.
And how has that? How do you feel about that shift as someone who's sort of in this world?
Well, I think that you're right. A lot of people on the surface may understand private equity or use the word. And oftentimes, at least with executives, certainly our clients understand how the market is stratified, right? But with executives, you have to really get them up to speed. Look, there's different types of private equity firms. They work different parts of the market. They have different philosophies. They grow businesses differently. The lower middle market is a very different field than the large cap buyout firms in terms of what they're trying to achieve to get their returns. And all that is a bit of an education process with some executives, right? Some executives have worked in the lower middle market. Some have worked in private equity portfolio companies before for lower middle market firms. So they understand the philosophy. And so it does take a little bit of coaching and training. We have different ways we coach up executives to get them in the mindset to be able to speak to lower middle market private equity firms, if that's the mandate, right? It's not all we work on, but in that environment. So it's a blessing and a curse. So someone comes in and thinks they understand private equity, and they're going to hold fast in that understanding, even though it's inaccurate, at least for our niche. It takes some education. Hopefully they're open-minded and they take to it. If they don't take to it, then it's probably not a good candidate for us to advance. So
Understood. And it does seem that things change and evolve so quickly as well that anybody who's holding to older information should probably stay open no matter what, from what I can tell, because it's
yeah, well,
fast, the
that's
pace.
actually a scorecard benchmark for us, which we would call humility, or the willingness to say, hey, I might be wrong. And so I should listen and take in new information and see if I can get to a higher level of thinking, because there's other data points, there's other information, other people might know more than me. How do I take that information and get to better conclusions as a result of hearing it? So synthesize it, if you will. So
yeah. So as a rec to rec, for me, I'm talking obviously to people who are either, partner level, owner level in recruiting firms and executive search firms for a living, right? Like this is what I'm doing every day. And it seems that through this very complex market that has shifted multiple times, especially in the past 3 years in short intervals, from a recruiting and search standpoint, some of the most stable verticals, or the most stable vertical in search that I have observed, has been doing exec level search in PE portcos. And it's been observed to me that in this kind of drastic changing market, there's just a lot of movement in PE backed portcos. And so it's a healthy market. This isn't necessarily a bad time to be working in that field. Is that an accurate, is that an oversimplification, do you think, of why it would be so stable compared to other markets which have had giant droughts and giant upswings in the past 3 years?
So it depends. Again, even that is kind of bifurcated between the private equity firms that believe in buy it first and then go find an executive,
right?
Versus a lot of our clients start with the executive and then go find the company, so that they know who their, I won't call it replacement leadership, but the leadership who's going to complement the incumbents is, and that's an expert. So, keep in mind, hopefully, if you recruit a CEO in any situation, that's the last time you're going to have to recruit that CEO, right?
Hopefully, yeah.
At least for the life of the hold, right? If they're doing their job well and they're executing the growth plan. So those don't come around as frequently as maybe other positions. So where the white space is, in our minds at least, is with those firms that believe that as we're starting new platforms, we like to start new platforms. Let's start with the executive who's an expert, who's a known quantity in that industry, in that niche, and understands the model of buy and build and has a good grasp of how that happens. And there's always opportunity. I hate to create competition where there isn't any, but the lower middle market in the private equity world here in the United States, at least, there's plenty of capital that are looking to acquire companies, which means whether they buy them and then go get the executive, or they're going to start with the executive, there's lots of opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. Which makes total sense to me. The get the executive first model is particularly fascinating to me as well, as somebody, like I say, who, wanted to have my own startups in various capacities before. It just feels like that leader-led approach just appeals to me. It feels almost more romantic in a way, like build the person and then the dream kind of thing.
Yeah, some of our clients call, bet on the jockey, not the horse. I don't know if that's the best analogy, but
it works though. I get it.
If you believe leadership matters and it matters to the outcomes of these portfolio companies, why wouldn't you start with the leader first, who has the same vision or can coalesce around the same vision as the private equity firm to execute the buy and build?
This is maybe just like a bigger, zoomed out question, but a lot of the mission of this podcast and just a lot of the conversations that I have with entrepreneurs and business owners in general and recruiting professionals centers around how we all, and of course no one has the answer to this question, I guess, yet, but how we feel that these existential questions are evolving because we have the ubiquity of these AI tools, and people are, and just different technologies in general, not just AI, right? And people are evolving the idea of what corporate structure looks like. A good example is a lot of people have told me, who are in search in more the go-to-market space, have been telling me that soon there may not be a CMO position standard, that often CMO duties are being lumped into what the CRO handles, and that they just feel like a lot of the things that happen in marketing are becoming, not obsolete, but are becoming doable with a couple of people in the room and AI and whatever. It's a lot easier and so on. So I just feel like there's a lot of existential questions about what's the structure of a company, what are the norms even. Do you feel like this like human-led approach, that the leader is more important than the bones of the company right now, possibly will grow in popularity as we see that a lot of things can be automated
Yeah,
or supplanted?
I mean, I think you have to segment the market from big, large companies. When I say that, if I could quantify it for a second, someone over
Totally.
$1 billion a year in revenues is going to see this differently than someone who's doing 50 million or 40 million or 20 million in
100%.
revenues, right?
Yeah.
I think the reality, at least how we see the world in our view, is the smaller the company, the more important the leadership is to executing that growth plan. That said, we see, and our clients would say this too, that things like AI, IoT are tools. The same with lean. Lean as a practice is a tool. And so you want to have executives who understand those tools, understand how they can be used to create what? Create value. And so how are they used to create value? It might be to reduce headcount, but it might be able to create things quicker that can be created without long lead times. Or another example, I'm seeing this, the very beginnings of this, and please no one tell me I'm wrong because I might be wrong about this, but I've seen people use AI tools to conduct lean Kaizen events. And if you know what a Kaizen event is, that usually has a physical person as the facilitator, right? So removing that facilitator and using an AI tool to get to improving processes and, creating more efficiencies or whatever the case may be. People are testing that tool out from what we've seen, right?
Yeah.
You can argue it's not going to be good. You can never remove the human facilitator from a Kaizen event, fine. But that's where we're seeing these tools used to help in these smaller companies get to what they're trying to get to, which is creating more value for the end customers, and as a result, more profitability for the company.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's great that you said more value for the end customers and more profitability, where I feel like there's a growing number of people that when I have conversations, high level sort of existential conversations about company operations and positions, who skip straight to the primary focus is to create profit for the stakeholders. The secondary process is to deliver value, and that seems to be growing in popularity. Not that I want to point any fingers, but I feel like it's sort of the Elon Musk style of what we're talking about.
So
you know what I mean?
we hit that notion right away in the book, right? So the first thing we talk about is what is the purpose of a company, and if you put 50 CEOs or COOs or whatever the case may be in a room, and you said, okay, what is the purpose of a company? Almost all of them, I can't predict this, almost all of them are going to say to make a profit, to create profit, create shareholder value. And yes, that's an obligation of the officers and directors, no question about it. The position of the book is that's an outcome, okay? And in fact, we take that notion that it's an outcome of delivering value to what I call in the book as the key stakeholder, the customer or the client. Because if you don't do that, if you don't deliver value to the customer or the client, all those other things which are dependent on that don't happen. At least in businesses where you're delivering services or products to an end customer, right? So if the customers, I mean, this seems like it's a simple notion if you think about it for a second. People have to want to buy your products and services and keep coming back because they think they're valuable for you to ultimately deliver that shareholder value and that profitability. So profitability in the book, as we talk about, is an outcome. So is shareholder value. So are employee benefits. And if you have employee profit sharing, or employee ownership, all those have value because you deliver value to the customers and the clients. And that is what in the book we call the key stakeholder. Everyone's a stakeholder in the business, but the key stakeholder has to be seen as the customer and the client. And the leader has to be able to inspire everyone to share the vision of delivering value to those customers and clients. That's how you get the outcomes that you want. That's at least the hypothesis we set forth in the book, and it's validated by the Lean Institute, where we take the concept of the purpose of any for-profit business is to deliver value to the end customers and clients so that the entity may prosper.
Yeah, I think I mean, listen, I'm 45 years old. I certainly grew up in the 80s when the adages were the customer's always right. I started working, when I was a teenager, and you were taught these kinds of things right away, that the customer is everything and whatever. So I was just indoctrinated to that kind of way of, this is how companies are, like,
Mhm.
from a very, very young age.
Right.
But I was surprised once I started to get some of these answers, even from younger people. And I don't know if this is just because the content they consume or the podcasts they listen to or whatever, but it seems like that notion is not popular, from what I can tell, that it should be to deliver goods and services to the end user first, or like value essentially to the end customers first, or clients, be they
Mhm.
businesses or consumers,
Yeah.
but rather that it's profit first. And I also feel like that may be the linchpin that makes this term of efficiency become, people say the term, oh yeah, efficiency, like to say, like, oh, that's why companies are evil, because they're trying to be efficient. Like, in the pop culture, even for people who are in recruitment or whatever, it feels like the term efficiency is being used to talk about headlines, like you see the massive downsize of people at Twitter, for example, of X now, right? Or whatever else. That the idea is that it doesn't have an end goal of delivering more value to the user, or to have a proper brand or whatever, that it's just about profit for the shareholders. It feels like there's a broken chain of like a
Yeah.
broken chain of telephone that happens, that comes from this kernel at the very core. Like you're saying, that's the premise of the book, is almost to sort of reestablish that as a
Yeah,
fundamental principle.
it is. And especially in the lower middle market. So certainly at scale, again, if you're a billion dollar, multi-billion dollar company, maybe a little bit with an entrenched market and entrenched customers, a little bit different. But there's plenty of examples in big market companies where a company took its eye off that ball of delivering value to the customer and had a disaster. I mean, I
Mhm.
think I think it was classic Pepsi example. It's a classic business school study, right, where they had to pull back an entire line of product because they weren't thinking about what the customers really wanted. And I
Right.
think you see larger customers at larger companies actually buy into this. And it's very
Yeah.
subtle, but if you get a survey from a large company that says, how did we do? Give us any input you can. They are trying to get into that. Have we satisfied the customers in a way where they believe they got value out of our service or product? And we advocate in the book for smaller companies to do a lot of surveys and do a
Mm.
lot of assessments, if you will, of how the end customers and even how the internal constituents, meaning employees, right, feel they're delivering to that end customer in terms of value, quality product, quality service.
Yeah, that's super, super interesting, because to your point, to me, it seems obvious. And I'm always shocked when people don't think that that's obvious. But yeah, it's just amazing that it has to be restated as a, as a,
Yeah, I know, I agree. And in the book, we talk about this idea of moving from a cult of personality to a culture of purpose. So a culture
Mm,
of personality and high performers to a culture of purpose. What's the one purpose you can get everyone to coalesce around and agree to, that you don't get that tension of, well, what's in it for me, which is a big challenge for all leaders because everyone has a what I call with me quotient, what's in it for me. But
yeah.
if you make it about the customer and the client and you get everyone coalesced around that purpose, all of a sudden people can focus on our purpose is to give whatever that value looks like to those customers and clients and delight them in that product or service. And it really helps remove some of those internal tensions that happen, especially in a buyout, right? So when a company's bought out by a private equity firm or someone else, and the people who weren't owners, but they have to stay, there's can be some pathologies, let's just call it that occur, right?
Yeah.
But when it's focused on the end customers and it's not focused on profit as the first primary goal, but as an outcome, it changes the culture of the business. That's one of the premises of the book. So
Yeah, and I think that this also, like, is interesting from the point of view, you said cult of personality, right? Where it's like, you want to have a visionary leader of your company, but if that's the main value proposition, then what happens in a merger or an acquisition, or something happens, or your leader says the wrong thing or whatever else, then your whole brand is gone, your internal culture is gone. So
right.
fragile and idiosyncratic that it's like hard to model for longevity.
Yeah, I mean it's key person risk, right? That's what
Yeah.
most people call it. And there's another section of the book where we talk about another way to try and lower that key person risk is always have a pool of candidates out there. We call it a succession pool, so you're not like caught off guard if someone call it goes to the beach, decides to go to the beach for whatever reason. There's people out there that you can create a quick and appropriate and effective succession plan, be it internal candidates or external candidates.
So what would you say, Ken, some of the challenges that you've observed in leaders in the lower mid market that you're addressing in the book? Like, what are some of sort of the high level challenges in either hiring leaders or in leaders being successful, like actually succeeding in their role versus getting packaged out or not
Yeah,
having a story?
so I'll try and prioritize those challenges, and may not be
Please.
exactly how you'll find it in the book. So I think the first thing, at least we believe in our view, and we built our model around this, is industry expertise. So we're not big believers in best athlete. We're big believers in domain experts who understand an industry, the customers, the vendors, the competitors, how the industry operates, the different value chains, things like that. That's very important. So why is that important in the lower middle market? You have a very small team in many cases in these smaller businesses, right? And those people have to trust that leader. I learned a long time ago, and this isn't my idea, this came from academic studies, that there's two types of trust. There's trust and intent, and there's also trust and competency. And so in these smaller businesses, when you bring an executive in who doesn't know an industry, the incumbents are going to immediately have a problem with trusting the competency of that particular leader.
For
So
sure.
we're not big believers in training a leader up. We're not big believers in training a leader up from a different industry in a smaller business, in a lower middle market business. They have to already be experts in that. So that's number one. A big challenge, I think, is finding those experts for any type of business that have been in that industry or at least adjacent to it and know the industry inside out. Everything we just talked about. The second is, and you call it EQ, and we agree with that, emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence and low ego. So a long time ago, date myself a little bit here, but in the 80s and 90s, everyone wanted a leader who came in with big elbows, command and control, told everyone the way it's going to be, didn't have any sense of emotional intelligence of how that might affect key people in the organization, or even people that were lower down in the organization who could become adversaries to the organization. So finding leaders who understand that, who come in with a low ego and high EQ and are sensitive to those incumbents, who might have been in that business for 15, 20, 30 years, and treating them with the respect that they deserve, while still being able to move the needle on how they behave so you can get higher levels of performance, is a real key attribute we look for, but it's a big challenge.
I would imagine it's a lot
yeah.
of moving parts to align at once in somebody's.
Yeah. And there's a lot of very successful executives who wouldn't agree that they need to have high EQ and low ego. And many of them are wired to have big egos, right? We used to, a long time ago, and I don't think this is appropriate anymore or accurate, but they used to call them A types or A personalities, right?
Right.
I don't think that's actually an accurate descriptor, and I don't want to get into all the different behaviors that come along with leadership. But yeah, assertive leadership is important at the right time, but so is collaborative leadership. And knowing how to balance that back and forth is an attribute we look for, but it's a big challenge for executives to have it.
Yeah, for sure. You want to make ssure that when someone says they're A-type personality, it's not that they are an a-hole, which sometimes is a joke.
Yeah, I may borrow that
please
from time to time,
You're
but
welcome.
I may not. It depends on if it's an appropriate setting. So.
It depends who you're talking to, yeah, for sure. But no, it's true though. Like you see this even for people who are at like the management level, like team lead level. There are some people who feel like the hallmark of any leadership is dominance and assertiveness in a certain kind of traditional like way that I think is often considered toxic now. But I guess it depends the cultures that people are in, right? If that's rewarded where they're at, well, then they're going to think amazing. I'm moving up the chain, and it's sort of validated throughout their career. So it makes sense that by the time they get up the chain enough, they're like, this is why I'm good, right? This is what's good about me. Like if it's been reinforced for 20 years, hard pressed for them to think of it otherwise, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I think you see that a lot of times with salespeople, right? So salespeople have to be assertive, but good salespeople typically, especially in more complex businesses, are consultative in nature. It's consultative selling. And so they have to get to know their clients. They have to ask the right kind of questions. They have to show empathy to a pain point and all that kind of stuff. So that they're a little bit better trained in this idea of EQ. And, I think EQ and low ego might get a bad rap in certain cultures for sure, where it's a command and control type environment. And there has to be assertive leadership that borders on management. And there's all sorts of books written about the difference between leadership and management. I won't bore your listeners with that. I encourage anyone to go research it because there is a difference between leadership and management. That said, being able to bring people in, get them coalesced, as I said before, around a common vision, a common goal, a common purpose, and getting buy-in daily, that is a leadership attribute, right? And that's something that can happen a lot of different ways. But certainly you want people to feel like they're part of the process. They're part and their voice is being heard. And so we speak to that in the book as well about surveying your internal people on an ongoing basis. We encourage people to use 360 tools, which I can talk about or not, totally up to you. Might bore your listeners, but if they're from the HR world, they'll understand what 360 tools are.
I would like to hear about 360 tools. I don't think this is boring at all. Actually, I think, Ken, that a lot of this is in a more granular way than we sometimes go, but in a good way, I think, is a little bit about validating the mission statement of what this entire podcast experiment has been, which is to just speak to a lot of people openly and see what they think about this idea. And honestly, I do feel that the advent of AI tools means that a lot of tasks can be automated and or handled by technology, meaning I think there's an opportunity to focus more on EQ and actually think about how that changes. What are the things we're looking for in a good leader, a good employee at any level, really. So yeah, all to say, I'd love to hear a little more about the 360 tools.
Yeah, so the EQ is emotional intelligence, right? That's what it's called. And so what we're saying is, as a leader, we understand people have emotions and we have to be cognizant of that. We have to recognize what those might be. What 360 tools do is they allow you to survey your internal group, be it your management team or the whole workforce, whatever the case may be, and curate those emotional feelings into actual scores, if you will, on how the behavior of a leader is not just making them feel, but making them behave and how it affects outcomes inside the business. So what it does is it takes that emotional angst that we want to be able to understand and actually curates it into quantifiable data points. So we can say, okay, as the leadership, we need to improve here, here, and here. Okay. And I don't want to push any particular 360 tool on your podcast. In the book, I think we talk about some of them. There's a lot of them out there. Generically, we like behavioral-based 360 tools. So how often do you see a leader engaging in this type of behavior? Right? And those behaviors have to be quantified by some third party that if you engage in those behaviors more frequently, you're going to get better outcomes, things like retention, things like higher sales, whatever the case may be. Or if you engage in a certain behavior more frequently, it's going to end up with bad outcomes, things like high turnover or lack of customer retention or whatever the case may be. So you want to be able to measure leadership behavior against the feelings, if you will, of the internal team based on metrics that matter. Because as we say in the book, and it's in one of my articles, we believe that people who want to give you feedback, as angry as it may seem or as adversarial as it may seem, they actually care about the organization. If they're upset enough to say, we need to change this, whatever this might be, they care, right? So if you can curate that, and especially in an anonymous feedback, it's important, we believe, that it be anonymous. Good 360 tools are truly anonymous. Small teams, it's somewhat difficult to get it truly anonymous, but you can get there. People can give their feedback in a way that is measurable in terms of behaviors that a leadership member of leadership can engage in more frequently. Okay, that leads to better outcomes in the organization. And here's the important thing for EQ: when you do 360s on all the leadership, including the CEO, you're telling those employees you care about what they think. That's a
Yes,
form
for
of
sure.
EQ, right?
Yep,
You're saying,
absolutely.
we understand you want to give input, you care about the organization, you're seeing things we may not want to see. Please tell us, but in this format. And you
Yeah.
don't have to worry about any retribution because it's all anonymous, right? So that's a good 360 tool will get you there. And that's why we advocate for them. It's a part of EQ, in our opinion,
Yeah,
demonstrating EQ.
that's a good point, that EQ runs kind of like both ways, right? And it if you value it as an organization and you think that it helps the cohesion of the company, then it's got to be like top to bottom and bottom to top, I guess, in order to really be living those principles.
Yeah, and that's the idea of a 360, right?
Yeah.
It's everyone in the organization looking at one particular individual. You can do it as the whole team, and then everyone gets a chance. And I'll just say one other thing about this idea of how it weaves into EQ. Everyone wants to know their voice has been heard, right? It's an old saying. I'm not saying anything new, but a 360 tool allows people to see, hey, my voice has been heard. I got a chance to say what I had to say, but it's done in a curated fashion and in a meaningful fashion with meaningful data that creates actionable improvement paths, if you will.
Yeah.
So.
No, I think that last piece is important, because you don't want to turn it into the complaint jar that people are just kind of
Yeah,
like
exactly. That's right.
meaninglessly getting angry about everything, and it is not actually rooted in anything, any helpful criticism per se.
Yeah, exactly. So it replaces the complaints jar or the
Yeah.
suggestion box or whatever the case may be, and it curates feedback from the internal team into actionable information that you can actually change behavior, change actions in a way that improves overall performance of the organization.
And are you seeing that things you're advocating, right? Meaning
Mm.
that the purpose of a company is to deliver value to the end user, or the end client, that EQ is actually important, top to bottom, bottom to top, 360 in an organization. Are you finding that these in the lower middle market people are very receptive to these, or is there some clients who are like, look, we just don't have time. We need to put this fire out right now. Everything you're saying is great in theory, but in practice, we actually just need to, you know what I mean? Put out these fires, or what's the reaction
Well,
like?
no, that's a great question. I don't think 360 tools are widely enough adopted in the lower middle market. I think there's a number of reasons why. One is time.
Yeah.
Okay. That said, I do see some informal use of 360 measurement. When I say informal, you could even look at a Kaizen event as a form of a 360 tool. It's around a process, right?
Right.
But you do see informal activities by well-developed executives to get the input of everyone on the team all the way down the line. The person on the shop floor, the secretary, the janitor, letting them know their voice is heard. It's meaningful. It's important to the leadership. And so you don't have to be using it's optimal to use a good tool that has been proven to be objective and anonymous, but it's not the only way to get there. And so, we do see a lot of CEOs who will just do check-ins. They'll walk around the plant. They'll go meet individually with people, not anonymous, but at least you're letting people speak their voice. So.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I feel like there's just so many moving parts to that, right? It's like people sometimes need to hire, and in order to hire, like you just as a recruiter who's in the trenches and who was doing lower level positions for a long while before now I'm dealing with higher ones.
Mm-hmm.
Lower level hires that are done quickly, there's often very little check to see if there's kind of an alignment to the company's principles or whatever. It's like, can you do this job? You have a good track record. You're available. We like you. You're hired. Start on Monday. But then it's like, you don't really necessarily, if you're going to employ this kind of 360 mentality, you've never even seen if these people align with the same principles of the company or whatever. So how much are you going to trust the data if you just have someone who's disgruntled and then you hired just because they needed a job or whatever, you know what I mean? Versus like, waiting forever, which is a trend I'm also seeing, waiting forever to hire someone who's so aligned with you that they could one day be the CEO of the company in every single position, waiting 6 months to hire a lower level person just because they have to have this magic formula of all the things, then you just kind of never hire also. So there's this, the building of the team suffers from that sometimes, you know what I mean?
Sure, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not going to argue, but I'm going to present a different perspective, which is part of leadership's obligation is to get new hires aligned with the values of the company, aligned with the core purpose of the company, and bought into how you do things around here, right? So align with the culture. So you won't necessarily be able to hire further down the org chart all the time with people who are necessarily a culture fit. It becomes the obligation of leadership and management to develop those people so that they become, I guess, manageable within the culture, at least, if not totally bought in and part of the culture. And I would say, again, I go back to what I said before, one of the quickest way to do that is get them focused on that key stakeholder, the end customer, the end client, right? What are we doing here? We're not just trying to make the boss rich or the shareholders rich, and you might be one of them, but we're actually trying to help people in whatever niche we're in. We're trying to deliver a service or a good that's going to make their life better or whatever the case may be. And that looks differently, product by product, service by service.
Absolutely. And I think for me, I am hopeful that we are entering into a phase of time where the cultural alignment and who the human being is going to go up in value versus what they've done or achieved up to this date, or what is their experience totally exact at the lower level, at just like the consultant level, let's say, or like the producer level. Because personally, I feel like teaching someone on processes seems to be much more easy and effective than aligning them on principles when they're not aligned to your core principles. And I think often the argument is time, right? It's just like, well, we don't have time to train. We don't have time to wait for someone who's aligned with the core principles. So let's just get somebody in the door who knows how to do the job.
You have to do that for sure. You have to get someone in who knows what they're doing for sure. But in terms of getting them aligned with core principles, core values, whatever you want to call them, that is a daily obligation of leadership. And there's a number of ways to do it. At the end of the book, we talk about this concept of modeling the way, which comes from Kouzes and Posner's work, leading by example. So daily leaders can get people to get closer to those core values and principles of what the company stands for by acting that way themselves.
Yeah,
right?
Makes total sense.
So, and you can look at every behavior, every action, every communication from leadership, and that's where the work actually starts. Are what we are doing as leaders aligned with what our stated core values, our stated principles, our stated pillars, whatever you want to call them, and our stated higher purpose, our purpose for those end customers? If leaders act in contradiction to what the stated values are, things break down very quickly. Trust breaks down, and you can't expect lower level people, I shouldn't say lower level people further out in the organizational chart, frontline people, to behave in alignment with those core values if leadership isn't.
Yeah.
Okay. It's, lead by example. So.
Yeah. And this is there's also a sort of a cynical and toxic kind of misnomer out there that you see among people who are kind of in the workforce for, let's say, a few years, but aren't really in a leadership position. They're still producing. And I deal with salespeople mostly, right? So this is perhaps the inherent toxicity of sales that's still lingering. But there seems to be this idea that, and this is maybe the difference between management and leadership, but that you slog through the job you kind of hate in order to get promoted into a managerial level where you have one layer of removal from frontline and one less layer of being involved in and dealing with people. And then as you move up the chart, your reward for slogging through the pain and suffering that is your life in this job is to get removed from being involved in the front line or whatever. and yet there are some people who see that progression entirely oppositely, that you're the living embodiment, like you're saying, of all the principles, and you're like more connected to the brand than ever. Maybe that is it's one of the core differences between like leadership and management, like you're saying. But is this something you encounter in leaders who've sort of come up through that more cynical viewpoint and gotten into senior leadership roles that don't really have that mindset?
Yeah, well, to be quite frank, if we encounter a cynical CEO type, probably not going to make it through our screening process, right? So no matter how they became cynical, whether they came up from, started, in the stocking shelves and became a CEO, or, went to MBA school and has always been in upper level management. Cynicism doesn't play well in the lower middle market, and it certainly doesn't play well with private equity owners. Now, being risk adverse or looking around corners and seeing where bear traps might be that could, make things go poorly for the company, that's important.
Sure,
that's
absolutely.
that's not cynicism. I think cynicism is where people say, well, we don't really mean what we say. We're just in it to make money.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I would say that that is an obligation of leadership to make sure that that is not endemic in a company, so that it's clear that we're here for something other than making money, a profit, increasing EBITDA, increasing shareholder value as an outcome of doing something that's more important, which is delivering value to customers and clients. And I'll keep coming back to that, because that is, we believe, the quickest way to get people coalesced, as I said in the beginning, around a common purpose that everyone can agree to. I mean, anyone who says, what do you mean? We don't have to deliver value to our customers and clients, say, well, this might not be the place for you, because that is exactly what we have to do for all the other things to happen. So,
and I mean, like, listen, I'll show my hand here and say that I'm pushing you to say these things also for my own personal agenda, that hearing out of your mouth as someone who has taught leadership, who has a book out on the subject, and who deals with this day in and day out. There is a cynicism that I encounter out there when people are looking to leave, who are not happy where they are, and they're like, all companies are the same, nobody cares, all CEOs are just greedy. And I'm like, honestly, no, like, it's really not true. Like, you want to align yourself with leadership that actually does care and embodies their own values and so on. But I think that we're in an age right now where people who've not quite attained that level yet, who are looking at getting into management, are sort of opting out or feeling like, no, it's all futile. I'm surrounded by people who don't truly care. They just want to make money. I'm just being exploited. And so I'm trying to get these sound bites from you that we can clip to give people a hope that it's like, maybe you're just not in the right organization where you don't align values wise, and that you should look at something where you do align.
Yeah, I mean, or the right industry, right? Because there are certainly some industries where, as an example, if you're on a trading desk, oil, commodities, whatever the case may be, it's a quantitative business. You are in it to make money. It's all about, watching trends and all that other kind of stuff that quants do. And that's probably the case, right? I mean, that's probably that's all you're going to get, is we're here to make money, figure out a way to make money in this particular market that we're trading. There's other industries that are like that too. Salespeople might feel that way if they're not getting the sales that they need. So you have to get sales, right? You have to generate revenue. So that's always going to be a pressure point. I would say that the bigger the business, the bigger the enterprise, the more likely someone's going to feel like, hey, we're not in this for the customer. That said, there are plenty of larger entities that their whole reason for being is around that concept. Do they carry it out at every single store or cash register or whatever the case may be? That's difficult to say that they can make it happen. Yeah. But I will use one example, and I used to use this when I was teaching, which is Whole Foods. I know Whole Foods has been sold, and so people question whether or not they're really coalesced around what they originally were.
Sure.
But the founder of Whole Foods wrote a book called Compassionate Capitalism, I think it's called. I may have it wrong. So I apologize to your listeners if I got the title wrong. But
I'll double check and we can point to it later.
Yeah, and put it up on your show notes. But he made a whole point about how he built Whole Foods into the powerhouse that it is before he sold it. And I still think a lot of people that work in Whole Foods believe in the values that they stand for. And Whole Foods does something you've seen a lot of larger organizations, which I think is smart. They put their core values in most of their stores up on the wall.
Mhm.
Okay. And I encourage organizations, to the extent they have core values, if they don't develop them,
Sure. Yeah.
whatever those core values or guiding principles are, and post them. And then once you post them, make sure that people know what behaviors are that manifest those core values in the workplace, and reward those behaviors as you see them, recognize those behaviors. And that's from the top down, right? And so if you're in an organization that doesn't have core values or doesn't post them anywhere, or they have core values and leadership management is operating or behaving in a contradictory fashion of those core values, you're probably going to feel like you're saying some of the people you work with feel like in the businesses or organizations they're in. And that, the only advice I could give is look for entities that have core values and have a demonstrative way to make sure those core values manifest in behaviors within the organization.
Yep. And I think that's a great point. Because yeah, there's certainly some people who it kind of feels like they're like, oh yeah, somebody in a consulting meeting told me to pick core values. Integrity, you know what I mean? And then they can't really speak to it or how that manages into their value proposition. And then there are other people who've have these wonderfully thought out stories of how they arrived at their core values and that they are coming from a real place and they're actually implemented very well. So I think it's like the former lazy version of these are our core values and then let's just go and make money is kind of what ruins some people on it forever. But trust Ken and I will agree that there are also a lot of people who do truly care and are really good at living up to their values out there.
Yeah, and I think it's more than that. It's more than just caring, right? You can care, but you don't manifest those core values within an organization. So you actually, what we encourage people to say, okay, here's a core value, and this is when I used to teach leadership, and more of my practice was based on leadership development. Take those core values and break them into at least 5 behaviors, hopefully 10 behaviors in the organization that manifest those core values, that show you're acting on those core values. Because let's face it, core values are just writings on a piece of paper or a wall if they don't manifest in behavior. Most people don't know what the behavior looks like that aligns with the core value that's up on a wall, unless you teach them, unless you reward it, you recognize it, and you behave that way yourself. So a little bit repetitive, but I just wanted to emphasize that.
No, it's great, and I appreciate it. And as we're somehow already drawing to the hour mark, I usually sort of end off I'll curtail a couple of my other questions, but I usually sort of try to pivot toward asking a little bit about how your perspective on the change, maybe in what you're seeing is different in what, let's say, either makes a good leader or a successful candidate for you, a hireable candidate in your mandates. Now, like post COVID, now that AI is getting integrated into everything, do you see what are the kinds of changes that you're seeing? I'd hope to see that they're more human driven, but I don't want to curb your answer. Like, how are you seeing the change over the past couple of years?
Well, that's a good question. I would say let's assume people have all the attributes and the characteristics that we've been talking about. The
Sure.
biggest change is knowledge of tech and tech enablement, and how tech enablement is occurring in their industry, in the businesses where they're supposed to be an expert. So it is something that we ask about. What do you know about tech enablement? A lot of businesses are in tech enablement. That's what they do, right?
Sure, yeah.
But in a lot of businesses, tech enablement hasn't necessarily been at the adoption rate that it is in other businesses. And we think that leaders have to understand how tech enablement, and I'm talking about AI, IoT, and other tech innovations that are being applied in that industry. They at least need to be aware of them and how they can be used and be able to speak to them, right? So this discussion around AI seems to change every day.
Yep.
And
Sure.
which AI tool is better and all that kind of stuff. So we want to know that executives, I think anyone now, to be up to date, has to be aware that they're out there. And it's many years ago, again, I'm dating myself, people argued, do we really need a website? And that might be crazy to people, but there was actually a time where people said, boy, do we really need a website? Now, any business now would say, It goes without saying you need a website, right? So
Yep.
that sounds silly, I know, in this day and age, but that's true of almost every tool that's coming down the pike right now. And so that's why I encourage people to see them as tools and know about them and be thinking about how those tools can be applied in your industry to, yes, make things more efficient, make things more effective, and help deliver more value to those end customers and clients that you're in business for to serve.
Yep, that's a great point. You mentioned for sure about the 360 tools as a means of, highlighting emotional quotient, emotional intelligence within organizations. So as more of like a qualitative analysis of what's going on in the culture than just the quantitative, speeds and feeds and numbers.
Yeah.
Are there other kind of qualitative attitudes that you feel maybe are lacking in the lower middle market that people should look at to sort of help with that, providing a quality good or service to the end user mind frame?
Well, there's lots of tools to do that, and there's lots of assessment tools, and I won't bore your audience with little short time that we have about all the assessment tools are out there. I will say that a lot of lower middle market businesses do not survey their customer base.
Mm-hmm.
And so their customer base is critical in terms of gathering information about how they feel about the services or products that they're buying from you. There's a lot of really good information in how people quote unquote feel. But again, you can take those qualitative feelings and you can quantify them.
Yeah.
In terms of, okay, how did we score? What can we do to improve products? That would argue for every organization has to have something of an innovation center, whether it's in the leadership team or one person who's always thinking about product improvement, service improvement. How do we get better in delivering things? And how do we demonstrate to our customers that we care about delivering things that are better? And that's a form of an emotional intelligence, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
We recognize that our customers may not be satisfied. They they may want better, whatever that might look like. And so we want to hear. And I think that in the lower middle market, it's not done as frequently as you see with bigger companies. I mean, I think if everyone on this podcast right now thinks about it, you probably got a survey today from some larger company.
Yeah, for sure.
That said, how do we do? And it's as simple as that. That's all I'm advocating for lower middle market businesses to do with their customer base is survey. So,
yep. Well, that is awesome. Ken, how can people, first of all, I'm going to share this. This is a link that I included in the comments here to this event. Anybody who's watching this on LinkedIn, and I will include it on the podcast episode if you're accessing this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever the case may be. This is a link to have a look at Ken's book. You can buy the paperback or buy it on Kindle. And this is also directly off of Octus Search Partners website, which I imagine is another great way people can interact with you. Ken, what's your favorite way for people to interact with you if their clients, candidates potentially want to reach out?
The quickest way and my favorite way is people send me an email. I see my emails, whether it be like most people on their desktop or their phone. I can respond to it quickly. Some people send texts, some people send me messages in LinkedIn, things like that. Those typically don't get responded to as quickly if you send me an email. Calling is probably the worst way because we're all recruiters. Not everyone on the call is a recruiter, but if you're a recruiter, you're on the phone most of the time, right? So a call comes in, you're probably not going to take it. So email is the best way to get a hold of me. And my email address is on the website. It's kgreenberg@octussearchpartners.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Ken. This has been super insightful. I thank you for letting me grill you on a million things. And I look forward to chatting further.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rick. I appreciate the opportunity to be on the call.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks to our listeners and hope to see you guys all next week.